By the end of World War II, the United States had commissioned 147 aircraft carriers. To put that in perspective, more than the rest of the world combined at that time. This wasn't luck or simple industrial output. It was the result of a 23-year evolution that transformed the aircraft carrier from an experimental oddity into the dominant weapon of naval warfare. This video examines every class of U.S. Navy carrier deployed during World War II, in chronological order from oldest to newest. We'll assess each based on 4 criteria: design philosophy, combat capability, strategic impact, and lessons learned that influence the next generation. The goal is to understand not just what these ships were, but why they mattered, and how American carrier doctrine evolved from uncertainty to overwhelming superiority in less than a quarter century. We begin in 1922, when the U.S. Navy didn't even know if aircraft could reliably operate from ships. The experiment, USS Langley, CV 1922. The first American aircraft carrier did not begin life as a warship at all. She was a coal-hauling vessel, a collier designed simply to feed the hungry boilers of the U.S. fleet. That ship was the USS Jupiter, AC-3, a steel-hulled vessel launched in 1912 that had already made naval history before her conversion. Jupiter was the U.S. Navy's first electrically propelled ship, a technological leap at the time. Ironically, this unremarkable collier, meant only to carry fuel, would be reborn as the vessel that changed the very nature of naval warfare. On the 20th of March 1922, she was recommissioned as USS Langley, CV-1, America's first aircraft carrier. The transformation was far from elegant. Engineers essentially grafted a 2-foot-long wooden flight deck over her hull, stripping away her coal-carrying superstructure and replacing it with an open, flat deck from bow to stern. There was no island superstructure as seen on later carriers. Instead, Langley featured a flush deck with a retractable pilot house and a single smokestack that could be tilted horizontally to clear the flight path. This design meant that navigation and command had to be conducted almost like a temporary operation, rudimentary and awkward by modern standards. Her performance was underwhelming. With a top speed of only 15 knots, Langley was slower than most battleships of her era and considerably slower than the cruisers and destroyers she was expected to work alongside. She could carry just 34 aircraft, mostly biplanes, and had limited hangar and maintenance space. Yet these shortcomings were almost irrelevant. Langley was never intended to project power or engage in combat. She was a question mark in steel. Could naval aviation work? Could fragile aircraft reliably take off from and land on a moving deck in open water? The answer was not immediate. Early flight operations were hazardous and improvisational. Pilots hurled their planes off the deck with little margin for error, and the landing system was crude. Langley's early arresting gear consisted of a series of cross-deck wires and sandbags, designed more to slow down planes than to stop them precisely. Crashes were common, and safety protocols had yet to be developed. But slowly, methodically, the crew of Langley and the pioneering aviators who flew from her began to work out the procedures that would define modern carrier aviation. It was on Langley's deck that the Navy first experimented with the tailhook and wire landing system that remains a hallmark of carrier operations today. It was here that the use of standardized hand signals was developed, where the crash barrier concept was introduced to protect parked aircraft, and where catapult-assisted launches were first refined. Every major innovation in carrier aviation that would later define World War II operations had its genesis aboard Langley. She became, in effect, a floating laboratory. Every Navy pilot who would one day fly from the more advanced carriers of the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise, Yorktown first trained on Langley. Carrier tactics such as deck handling, coordinated launch and recovery cycles, and air group formations were all tested here in their most rudimentary form. Even though Langley's small air wing could not match the power of battleship broadsides or heavy cruisers, she proved something far more valuable: that aircraft, with their range, speed, and striking power, could project influence well beyond the horizon, something no battleship could achieve. By the late 1930s, Langley was hopelessly outdated. Her slow speed and small capacity made her unfit for frontline duty. She was stripped of her flight deck in 1937 and converted into a seaplane tender, redesignated AV-3. In this new role, she supported reconnaissance aircraft and ferried planes across the Pacific, a role that suited her limitations. Her end came in the desperate early days of the Pacific War. In February 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Langley was tasked with ferrying P-40 fighters to Java to bolster Allied defenses against the rapidly advancing Japanese. On February 27, south of Java, Japanese bombers intercepted her convoy. Despite evasive maneuvers, Langley was struck by 5 bombs. She quickly became an inferno, listing and losing power. To prevent capture, her escort's destroyers USS Whipple and USS Edsall rescued survivors and scuttled her with torpedoes. In the chaos of early 1942, her loss was little more than a footnote amid larger catastrophes like the fall of Singapore and the Battle of the Java Sea. The Battlecruiser carriers. Lexington-Class, 1927. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was intended to limit naval arms races, but it inadvertently opened the door to the age of the aircraft carrier. The treaty froze battleship construction for 10 years and cancelled most new battlecruisers, but in a loophole, it permitted nations to convert existing capital ship hulls into carriers. For the United States Navy, this was a godsend. At the time, America lagged behind Britain and Japan in carrier development. Britain already had HMS Furious and HMS Hermes in service, and Japan had just commissioned Hosho, the world's first purpose-built carrier. The US had only the experimental Langley, hardly a warfighting vessel. To catch up, the Navy turned to 6 massive Lexington-class battlecruiser hulls that had been laid down during World War I. Originally, the Lexingtons were designed to be some of the fastest and most heavily armed battlecruisers in the world. Ships with 8 16-inch guns and a blistering 35-knot speed, intended to outrun anything they couldn't outgun. When the treaty rendered them obsolete as battlecruisers, the Navy salvaged the investment by converting 2 hulls, Lexington and Saratoga, into carriers. This decision would profoundly shape U.S. naval aviation. Commissioned in 1927, Lexington CV-2 and Saratoga CV-3 were unlike anything else afloat. At over 36,000 tons, they were by far the largest aircraft carriers in the world, dwarfing Britain's converted carriers and Japan's modest Akagi in their early form. Their 888-foot flight decks were long enough to handle virtually any aircraft of the day, while their cavernous enclosed hangars provided a scale of aviation maintenance unseen before. Each could carry roughly 90 aircraft, an air group size not matched by most other navies until well into World War II. Their propulsion, inherited from their battlecruiser origins, gave them a speed of 33 knots, blistering for a carrier even by modern standards. This meant they could outrun most surface ships and keep pace with fast cruiser screens, a critical advantage in carrier warfare. For a time, they were the envy of the world. Naval observers recognized that the U.S. had, almost by accident, created floating air bases that could project power thousands of miles from American shores. In fleet exercises of the late 1920s and 1930s, the Lexington-class demonstrated both the promise and peril of carrier aviation. Their air groups could simulate strikes against Panama, Hawaii, and even the West Coast, shocking naval planners and proving that carriers could bypass traditional lines of battleships and coastal defenses. But the ships were not without serious flaws. Their battlecruiser heritage imposed design compromises. The propulsion system was immense and complex, requiring long runs of steam lines and electrical conduits that wound through the ship in ways never intended for aviation operations. That vulnerability revealed itself with tragic clarity at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. During the battle's climactic carrier duel, Lexington absorbed 2 torpedo hits and multiple bomb strikes. At first, her damage control teams performed brilliantly. Within an hour, the fires were largely contained, and the ship appeared to be stabilizing. Then, disaster struck. Gasoline vapors, leaked from ruptured fuel lines, ignited in the ventilation system. At 12:47 p.m., a massive internal explosion tore through the carrier. More detonations followed as fires reached aviation fuel stores. Despite desperate efforts, the ship became an inferno. By evening, Captain Frederick C. Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. Over 200 sailors lost their lives. The destroyer Phelps administered the final blow, firing torpedoes to sink her and prevent capture. The Lady Lex, as her crew called her, went down as the first U.S. fleet carrier lost in combat. Her sister ship, Saratoga, had a very different but equally frustrating wartime career. She survived the war, but her record was marked by misfortune. On the 11th of January 1942, barely a month after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine torpedoed her off Hawaii, forcing 3 months of repairs. On August 31, she was torpedoed again, taking her out of the action during the critical Guadalcanal campaign. Later that year, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, she was struck by a bomb and once more returned to dock. Time and again, when the U.S. Navy desperately needed carriers at Midway, at Santa Cruz, Saratoga was unavailable. Though she eventually supported operations in the Indian Ocean and later trained aviators, her absence from the decisive carrier battles of 1942 underscored the problem of having too few carriers in the Pacific. The False Economy, USS Ranger CV-4, 1934. The Washington Naval Treaty did more than cap the size of individual ships. It imposed strict total tonnage limits on each signatory's carrier fleet. For the United States, that ceiling was 135,000 tons. With the massive Lexington and Saratoga already consuming nearly half that allotment, the Navy faced a crucial design dilemma. Should it continue building a few large, capable carriers, or stretch its quota by building several smaller, cheaper ones? In theory, more hulls meant more operational flexibility. In practice, it was a fatal miscalculation. The ship that embodied this flawed logic was USS Ranger CV-4. Commissioned in 1934, Ranger displaced just 14,500 tons, barely more than half the size of Britain's contemporary Ark Royal and a fraction of her American predecessors. To fit under treaty limits and justify the cost, compromises were made everywhere. She was designed on paper to be efficient, but in steel she was fragile and underpowered. Her deficiencies began with speed. At 29 knots, she was simply too slow to operate with the Navy's emerging fast carrier task forces. A carrier unable to match the speed of battleships and cruisers was more than a liability, it was a sitting duck. Her 769-foot flight deck was short by fleet standards, limiting aircraft takeoff runs and complicating deck operations. Her hangar deck had low overhead clearance, meaning she could not accommodate the larger, more advanced aircraft entering service by the late 1932. With limited internal volume, her stores of aviation fuel and ammunition were modest, which capped her striking power and sharply reduced her operational endurance. Worst of all, she was virtually unarmored. Her belt was thin, her flight deck completely unprotected. Against the punishing air and submarine threats of the Pacific, she would not have lasted an hour under concentrated attack. When war came in 1941, the Navy quickly acknowledged what many officers had suspected for years. Ranger was unfit for frontline duty in the Pacific. Instead, she was confined to the Atlantic, where the German threat, while dangerous, was less overwhelming, and where her weaknesses were less likely to be exposed. There she conducted anti-submarine patrols, escorted convoys, and ferried aircraft to forward bases. She did see one brief moment of offensive action. In November 1943, during Operation Leader, Ranger launched 2 small airstrikes against German shipping off the coast of Norway. The raids inflicted modest damage, sinking or crippling several vessels, and gave her crew a taste of combat. But this was the exception. By mid-1944, she was withdrawn from active combat roles entirely and reassigned as a training carrier, preparing new pilots for the expanding carrier fleet that was now fighting its way across the Pacific. In hindsight, Ranger was a cautionary tale written in steel. She embodied the dangers of compromise in warship design. Naval planners had sought to maximize numbers by cutting capability, but the result was a ship that consumed scarce treaty tonnage and shipyard resources while contributing little to the decisive theater of war. In a sense, she was worse than nothing. A ship that looked like a fleet carrier on paper, but could not fight as one in practice. The lesson was clear. False economy has no place in naval strategy. If the Navy was to win the coming war, it needed carriers built for combat, not for quotas. Better to have fewer carriers that could endure enemy fire, operate modern aircraft, and keep pace with the fleet, than a dozen inadequate ones confined to second-line duties. That realization directly influenced the next class of American carriers. The Yorktown-class ships, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, would abandon the idea of small and cheap. They were designed as fully capable fleet carriers, large enough, fast enough, and strong enough to fight toe-to-toe with the Japanese across the Pacific. Where Ranger had been a mistake, the Yorktowns would become legends. The first real carriers, Yorktown-Class, 1,937 to 1,941. The Yorktown-Class represented a turning point in American naval architecture, the moment when the U.S. Navy finally designed carriers not as conversions, not as budget compromises, but as warships built from the keel up to dominate at sea. By the mid-1932s, naval planners had absorbed the lessons of Langley, the limitations of Ranger, and the hard-earned experience of operating the giant Lexingtons. They now understood what a fleet carrier needed: speed, survivability, range, and the ability to keep aircraft flowing in steady cycles of strike and recovery. 3 ships emerged from this philosophy: USS Yorktown, CV-5, commissioned in 1937, USS Enterprise, CV-6, in 1938, and USS Hornet, CV-8, in 1941. On paper, they displaced 20,000 tons, standard a middle ground between the enormous Lexingtons and the underweight Ranger. In practice, they were perfectly balanced machines of war. At 824 feet long, with flight decks wide enough for safe aircraft handling yet proportioned to maintain stability at sea, they were elegant and efficient designs. Their performance metrics reflected this balance. With a top speed of 32 knots, they could steam comfortably with the battle line and outrun most surface threats. Their protection was substantial without being excessive. A 2.5 to 4-inch armored belt along the waterline, combined with an armored hangar deck that shielded machinery and magazines from aerial attack. They carried an air group of roughly 90 planes on par with the much larger Lexingtons, giving them striking power without sacrificing maneuverability. Their range was immense, designed with the Pacific in mind, enabling long voyages between resupply without tethering them to fuel convoys. But the real innovation of the Yorktown-Class was not in armor or armament. It was in how they managed air operations. Previous carriers relied on large centerline elevators that cut gaping holes into the flight deck whenever in use. Every time an aircraft was raised or lowered, flight operations had to pause. The Yorktowns introduced a revolutionary solution: the deck-edge elevator. This third lift, mounted on the port side of the ship and cantilevered outward, allowed aircraft to move between hangar and flight deck without interrupting landings or launches. This single innovation transformed carrier warfare. Aircraft could be rearmed, refueled, and repositioned while the air wing continued operating, dramatically increasing sortie rates and combat tempo. The Yorktowns were also built with survivability in mind. Damage control was woven into their design, not treated as an afterthought. Watertight compartments, redundant pumping systems, fire suppression networks, and extensively trained crews gave them resilience. The loss of Lexington at Coral Sea had shown that a carrier could survive bomb and torpedo hits only to be destroyed by fires and secondary explosions. The Yorktowns were designed to resist that fate, giving them a margin of endurance in the brutal environment of naval aviation combat. By 1941, the United States had finally produced a carrier design that worked. The Yorktowns were fast enough, tough enough, and powerful enough to conduct fleet operations against any opponent. The flaw was not in the ships, but in the numbers. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had only 7 fleet carriers in commission: the 2 Lexingtons, the experimental Ranger, the 3 Yorktowns, and Wasp, a slightly smaller, cost-trimmed derivative built with leftover treaty tonnage. Japan entered the war with 10 fleet carriers, and more under construction. The Yorktowns would be asked to do more than they were ever designed for, and they did. In the desperate first year of the Pacific War, when American industry was only beginning to mobilize, it was the Yorktown-Class that stood as the Navy's backbone. Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet carried the fight from the early raids on Japanese bases to the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, to the battles of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. They were not just warships, they were the shield that bought time for America to build the vast Essex-class fleets that would later sweep the Pacific. The Yorktown-class was proof of concept turned into fighting steel. Where Langley had been a laboratory, Lexington and Saratoga experiments in scale, and Ranger, a cautionary tale of false economy, the Yorktowns were the first true blueprint of the modern carrier. Their balance of speed, protection, air group size, and operational efficiency set the standard not only for their successors but for every U.S. carrier design of the 20th century. USS Wasp, CV-7, the treaty's last compromise. USS Wasp, CV-7, occupies an awkward position in carrier development. She was neither a full repetition of the successful Yorktown design nor a completely new class. Instead, she was built with the 15,000 tons of carrier tonnage remaining under the Washington Naval Treaty limits after Ranger and the 3 Yorktowns consumed the rest. The Navy chose to build one more carrier rather than leave that tonnage unused. The result was a ship that incorporated Yorktown-class features but at a reduced scale. Wasp was commissioned in April 1940, displacing 14,700 tons, about 5,000 tons lighter than a Yorktown. She was 741 feet long with a narrower beam, which made her more cramped internally. Her aircraft capacity was reduced to around 76 planes. Her protection was lighter, a thinner armor belt, less comprehensive compartmentalization. Her propulsion system generated 75,000 shaft horsepower, compared to the Yorktown's 120,000, limiting her top speed to 29.5 knots. The compromises were intentional. The Navy understood that Wasp would be less capable than a full-sized fleet carrier, but judged that having an additional flight deck, even a reduced one, was preferable to having none. This calculation proved partially correct. Wasp's wartime service was brief. She spent early 1,942 inches the Atlantic, ferrying RAF Spitfires to Malta, a critical mission that helped sustain the besieged island. In June 1942, she was transferred to the Pacific to reinforce the depleted carrier force. She participated in the Guadalcanal campaign, providing air cover for the Marine landings and conducting strikes against Japanese positions. On the 15th of September 1942, while operating southeast of Guadalcanal, Wasp was struck by 3 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-19. The hits were devastating. Fires ignited aviation fuel and spread rapidly through the hangar deck. Her lighter protection and reduced compartmentalization meant damage spread faster than on a Yorktown-class ship. Within an hour, fires were out of control. The order to abandon ship was given. Escorting destroyers scuttled her with torpedoes that evening. 193 men died. Wasp's loss reinforced the lesson from Ranger. Treaty-induced compromises produce vulnerable ships. But unlike Ranger, Wasp at least saw combat in the primary theater and contributed to critical operations before her loss. She represented the last carrier the U.S. Navy would build under treaty constraints. Future designs would be unconstrained by tonnage limits and optimized for combat effectiveness alone. Holding the line, Coral Sea and Midway, May-June 1942. The first 6 months of the Pacific War were catastrophic for the United States. Pearl Harbor destroyed the battleship fleet, the Philippines fell, Wake Island fell, Guam fell, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies. The Navy's carrier force was the only offensive weapon available, and it was drastically outnumbered. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first carrier versus carrier engagement in naval history. USS Yorktown and USS Lexington intercepted a Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby, New Guinea. The battle was chaotic. Both sides launched strikes that crossed in mid-air, attacking each other's carriers simultaneously. Yorktown took a bomb hit but remained operational. Lexington was hit by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Her crew contained the damage, extinguished fires, and restored partial power. Then, at 12:47 p.m., the accumulated gasoline vapors detonated. The resulting explosion destroyed her from within. She sank that evening. Tactically, Coral Sea was a draw. Both sides lost 1 carrier, but strategically, it was an American victory. The Japanese invasion force turned back. Port Moresby and the sea route to Australia remained in Allied hands. More importantly, the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku was damaged, and the carrier Zuikaku's air group was decimated. Both would miss the next battle. That battle came 1 month later at Midway. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto assembled a massive fleet, 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers to invade Midway Atoll and draw out the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet for destruction. The Americans, forewarned by codebreakers, positioned 3 carriers north of Midway, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which had been repaired in an impossible 3 days at Pearl Harbor after the initial damage assessment suggested 3 months of work. On the morning of the 4th of June 1942, the American carriers launched strikes against the Japanese fleet. The first wave torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers was slaughtered. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 35 of 41 attacking planes, not a single torpedo hit. But the attack pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later, they found the Japanese carriers defenseless, their decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft. In 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally wounded. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that hit Yorktown with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. She was abandoned, survived for 2 days, and was finally sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow. The Battle of Midway broke Japanese naval aviation. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their veteran air crews was irreplaceable. Japan never regained the initiative in the Pacific, but the cost was severe. By mid-1942, the The US had lost Langley, Lexington, and Yorktown. Saratoga was in repair. Wasp would be sunk by a submarine in September. Hornet would be lost in October at the Battle of Santa Cruz. By November 1942, the U.S. Navy had one operational fleet carrier, USS Enterprise, facing the entire Japanese combined fleet. The Yorktown-Class had done what it was built to do: fight a numerically superior enemy and trade space for time. But the Navy desperately needed reinforcements. The new Essex-class carriers were still under construction, months away from completion. The solution was improvisation. USS Enterprise, CV-6. The Big E. No single ship better represents the U.S. Navy's carrier war in the Pacific than USS Enterprise. If the Yorktown-class as a whole held the line in 1942, Enterprise was the ship that personally carried the Navy through its darkest hour. Her service record is unmatched in American naval history. Enterprise was at sea on the 7th of December 1941, delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island. Her aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor in the midst of the Japanese attack. From that moment, she was in constant action. In early 1942, she conducted hit-and-run raids on Japanese-held islands, striking the Marshall and Gilbert Islands when the Navy had little else to offer. In April 1942, Enterprise escorted USS Hornet during the Doolittle raid, the mission that launched Army B-25 bombers from Hornet's deck to strike Tokyo. While Hornet carried the bombers, Enterprise provided fighter cover for the task force. At Midway in June 1942, Enterprise's air group delivered the decisive blow. Her dive bombers, arriving over the Japanese fleet at the critical moment, sank the carriers Kaga and Akagi. Later that day, they returned and sank Hiryu. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway fell to aircraft from Enterprise. The Guadalcanal campaign tested her endurance. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, she took 3 bomb hits but remained operational. 2 months later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, she was hit by 2 bombs and suffered damage from a crashed aircraft. Hornet was sunk in that battle. Enterprise survived, barely. With Saratoga under repair and Hornet gone, Enterprise became the only operational American fleet carrier in the Pacific. For 1 month, November 1942, she was the entire American carrier force. Her air group flew continuous missions supporting the Marines on Guadalcanal, intercepting Japanese air raids, striking Japanese shipping. If Enterprise had been sunk during this period, the strategic situation would have become untenable. The Japanese would have achieved local naval superiority, potentially reversing the outcome at Guadalcanal. She survived. After emergency repairs, she returned to action in 1943 and participated in nearly every major operation of the Central Pacific Campaign: the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, the strike on Truk Lagoon, the Marianas, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot Enterprise was one of 15 carriers that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, she participated in the destruction of the last Japanese carrier force. In May 1945, off Okinawa, she was hit by a kamikaze. The impact killed 14 men and caused significant damage. This final hit put her out of the war. She returned to the United States for repairs that were still ongoing when Japan surrendered. Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, the most of any U.S. warship in World War II. She sank 71 enemy ships and destroyed 911 aircraft. She received the first-ever Presidential Unit Citation awarded to an aircraft carrier. Her nicknames, the Big E, the Lucky E, the Grey Ghost, became legendary. Sailors across the fleet knew that if Enterprise was in the fight, the Americans had a chance. After the war, despite a nationwide campaign to preserve her as a museum ship, Enterprise was scrapped in 1958. The decision remains controversial, but her name lives on. The world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, commissioned in 1961, was CVN-65 Enterprise. A new Ford-class carrier, CVN-80, is currently under construction and will carry the name into the future. Enterprise represents what a well-designed ship with a well-trained crew can accomplish. She was not invincible, she was damaged repeatedly, but her Yorktown-class design gave her the protection and damage control capability to survive hits that would have sunk lesser ships, and her crew's skill kept her operational through battles that should have put her in the repair yards for months. She was the right ship at the right time, and she saved the Pacific campaign when no other ship could. USS Hornet CV-8, the Doolittle carrier. USS Hornet CV-8, the final ship of the Yorktown-Class, had the shortest and most intense career of any American fleet carrier. Commissioned in October 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, she missed the initial shock of the war. But her first major operation cemented her place in history. In April 1942, with the Pacific War going badly and American morale at its lowest point, the Navy launched a top-secret mission. USS Hornet sailed from San Francisco with 16 North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers lashed to her flight deck. These were Army Air Force's planes far too large to ever land back on a carrier. The mission, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, was a one-way strike on Tokyo. The task force penetrated deep into Japanese-controlled waters. On the 18th of April 1942, the B-25 seconds launched from Hornet's deck and struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The physical damage was minimal. These were medium bombers carrying limited ordnance, but the psychological impact was enormous. For Japan, it proved that the home islands were not invulnerable, a shock that influenced their decision to attack Midway in an attempt to draw out and destroy the American carriers. For the United States, it was a massive morale boost at a time when every news report was about defeats and withdrawals. Hornet then participated in the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Her role was less successful than Enterprise's. Her torpedo bomber squadron, VT-8, launched an attack on the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Not a single man survived except for Ensign George Gay, who was rescued the next day after floating in the ocean. The sacrifice of VT-8 contributed to pulling Japanese fighters down to low altitude, but the cost was horrific. Hornet's dive bombers had better luck, participating in the sinking of the Japanese cruiser Mikuma. Hornet's end came 4 months later, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942. The U.S. carriers Hornet and Enterprise faced a numerically superior Japanese force off Guadalcanal. Japanese aircraft hit Hornet with multiple bombs and 2 torpedoes. 2 Japanese aircraft, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, deliberately crashed into her proto-kamikaze attacks before the tactic became official doctrine. The damage was catastrophic. Fires swept the ship. Power failed. She went dead in the water. The crew abandoned ship. American destroyers attempted to scuttle her to prevent capture, firing 9 torpedoes and over 400 5-inch shells into the hull. Hornet refused to sink. The destroyers were forced to withdraw when a Japanese surface force approached. Japanese destroyers finished her off with their own torpedoes. Hornet's career lasted exactly 1 year, October 1941 to October 1942. She participated in 2 of the most significant carrier operations of the war. The Doolittle Raid, which proved carriers could strike the enemy homeland, and Santa Cruz, where her loss, combined with damage to Enterprise, left the Navy with its single carrier crisis in November 1942. Her sacrifice, along with Yorktown's at Midway and Wasp's loss in September, bought the time necessary for the Essex-class to reach the fleet. The pre-war carriers absorbed the initial Japanese onslaught and prevented total defeat during the period when American production had not yet reached full capacity. Without their sacrifice, there would have been no opportunity for the Essex-class to arrive and turn the tide. The crisis point. November 1942. One carrier left. In the waters northeast of Guadalcanal, 2 American carriers prepared to meet the full weight of Japan's striking power. USS Hornet CV-8, the newest of the Yorktown-Class, and USS Enterprise CV-6, the veteran Big E, steamed into combat against a superior Japanese carrier force. The battle that followed would test not only the ships themselves but the very survival of America's Pacific strategy. The fighting was merciless. Hornet quickly became the primary target of Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes. She absorbed an extraordinary amount of punishment. Multiple bomb strikes tore open her decks, while torpedoes ripped into her hull below the waterline. To make matters worse, 2 crippled Japanese planes deliberately crashed into her, exploding in fireballs across the flight deck. These were not yet the organized kamikaze missions that would appear in 1944, but the effect was the same. Desperate pilots turning their aircraft into weapons of last resort. Within hours, Hornet was a wreck. Flames spread uncontrollably, power was lost, and she lay dead in the water, listing, with her crew ordered to abandon ship. American destroyers tried to spare her the indignity of capture by finishing her off. They launched 9 torpedoes and poured more than 400 5-inch shells into her shattered hull. Incredibly, Hornet still refused to sink, her steel carcass stubbornly clinging to the surface. That night, Japanese destroyers finally moved in and put an end to her with their own torpedoes. The ship that had launched the Doolittle raid only 6 months earlier was gone. Enterprise fought on, absorbing several bomb hits of her own. Fires erupted, holes punched through her decks, yet her crew's legendary damage control efforts kept her afloat. She limped away from the battle, battered but alive, earning once again her reputation as the most resilient carrier in the fleet. But the victory was hollow. With Hornet lost and Enterprise severely damaged, the United States Navy suddenly found itself facing an existential crisis in the Pacific. For a brief and terrifying stretch in November 1942, Enterprise was the only fully operational American fleet carrier left in the theater. Saratoga, torpedoed in August, remained stuck in the shipyard. Wasp had already been sunk. The mighty Essex-class carriers, designed to finally give America numerical superiority, were still only half-built hulls on the slips of American shipyards. That meant a single ship, 1 platform, 1 flight deck stood between the Imperial Japanese Navy and total control of the Pacific sea lanes. If Enterprise went down before reinforcements arrived, the balance of power at sea would tilt fatally toward Japan. Supply lines to Guadalcanal would be cut. The Marines ashore, already fighting desperately, would be starved of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. The hard-fought American foothold in the Solomon Islands could vanish overnight. This situation was unacceptable. Something had to be done. The problem was time. A fleet carrier was a massive undertaking, a floating airfield that normally required 2 to 3 years of construction before commissioning. The United States simply did not have that luxury. Every month without new carriers was a month the Japanese could exploit their advantage. At this moment of peril, President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself intervened. More than just a political leader, Roosevelt had long been a student of naval power. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I and followed ship design debates closely. He understood both the strategic stakes and the technical realities. If fleet carriers could not be built in time, then alternatives had to be found. 2 emergency solutions emerged. The first was to take cruiser hulls already under construction and convert them into light carriers. These ships would not be as fast or as spacious as purpose-built carriers, but they could carry a modest air group and keep pace with the fleet. The second solution was even more radical: mass-produce small escort carriers by adapting merchant ship designs. These jeep carriers, as they came to be called, would be slow and vulnerable, never suited to stand in a fleet engagement, but they could escort convoys, provide air cover, and operate in secondary roles. Both concepts represented compromises. Neither the light carriers nor the escort carriers could match the speed, striking power, or survivability of a Yorktown or an Essex. But in late 1942, good enough, arriving in 6 months, was infinitely better than perfect, arriving in 2 years. What followed was a staggering demonstration of American industrial ingenuity. Shipyards across the country lit up day and night. Sparks from welding torches showered the steel hulls as crews reshaped cruiser decks into carrier flight decks. Merchant vessels, once intended to haul cargo across the Atlantic, were transformed into warships almost overnight. America's massive industrial base, already mobilized for total war, bent its full weight toward producing flight decks as quickly as humanly possible. It became a race against time, not just of machines, but of will. The Japanese Navy still held more carriers, more experienced pilots, and the initiative in the Pacific. The question was whether the United States could get enough decks into the fight before Enterprise was sunk, before the Marines on Guadalcanal were starved out, before the balance tipped too far to recover. For the men at Pearl Harbor and the workers in the shipyards, the stakes could not have been clearer. The fate of the Pacific, and perhaps of the war itself, would hinge on whether America could conjure carriers out of thin air faster than the Japanese could sink them. The cruiser carriers. Independence-class CVLs. 1,943. The Independence-class light carriers were born from desperation and presidential directive. In January 1942, President Roosevelt noted that Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls were already under construction in significant numbers. Converting some of these hulls to carriers would be far faster than starting new carrier construction from scratch. The Navy's Bureau of Ships was initially skeptical. Cruiser hulls were long and narrow, poorly suited for flight deck operations. But with the crisis in the Pacific worsening, the decision was made. 9 Cleveland-class cruisers were pulled from the construction line and converted. The conversion process was straightforward in concept. Remove the cruiser superstructure and armament, install a flight deck and small island, and add minimal hangar space. The result was the Independence-class, designated CVL for Carrier, Escort, Light. The first, USS Independence, CVL-22, was commissioned in January 1943, less than a year from the start of conversion. 8 more followed through 1,943. The ships retained the fundamental characteristics of their cruiser origins, which defined both their strengths and limitations. Their primary asset was speed. The original cruiser machinery remained intact, giving them a top speed of over 31 knots. This allowed them to integrate seamlessly into fast carrier task forces alongside the larger Essex-class carriers once those arrived. They were also produced quickly, 9 ships, operational in 1943, when every additional flight deck mattered. But the compromises were severe. The cruiser hull was narrow, resulting in a flight deck only 3 feet wide at its narrowest point. For comparison, the Essex-class flight deck was over 100 feet wide. This made takeoffs and landings significantly more difficult, especially in rough seas or crosswinds. Pilots nicknamed the CVLs death traps for good reason. Landing on a narrow pitching deck at night was one of the most hazardous operations in naval aviation. The narrow hull also meant a cramped hangar deck with low overhead clearance. This limited both the number and type of aircraft that could be carried. Initial air groups were planned for only 30 aircraft, about 1/3 the capacity of a fleet carrier. This was later increased to around 34 planes, typically 24 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters and 9 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The small air group and limited hangar space also complicated maintenance and rearming operations. Protection was minimal. The ships retained the light armor of a cruiser, adequate against destroyer and cruiser gunfire, but insufficient against bombs or torpedoes. Their aviation fuel storage and munitions magazines were poorly protected compared to purpose-built carriers. A single well-placed hit could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. Finally, the hull's narrow beam made the ships prone to severe rolling and pitching in heavy seas. This not only complicated flight operations but made the ships miserable platforms to serve on. Crew comfort was abysmal: tight quarters, constant motion, poor ventilation in the hangar spaces. Despite these limitations, the Independence-class succeeded in their assigned role. They were never intended to operate independently. Instead, they were integrated into the main carrier task groups as supplementary units. Their primary mission was combat air patrol, using their fighters to provide a defensive screen over the task force, which freed up deck space on the larger Essex-class carriers for assembling massive strike packages. In this role, they were highly effective. All 9 ships saw extensive combat across the Central Pacific Campaign: the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, Marianas, Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They provided fighter cover for the fleet, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and occasionally launched their own strikes against shore targets. One ship was lost. USS Princeton CVL-23 was hit by a single Japanese bomb during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, igniting fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting fires reached the torpedo magazine, which detonated in a massive explosion that destroyed the ship and caused heavy casualties on the cruiser USS Birmingham, which was alongside assisting with firefighting. The loss of Princeton illustrated the vulnerability inherent in the design. Minimal armor and a compact, combustible-filled interior made them fragile platforms. But the other 8 ships survived the war and served into the late 1942 before being decommissioned. The Independence-class proved that rapid conversion of existing hulls could produce functional, if flawed, carriers in timeframes impossible for new construction. They bought the Navy time when time was the scarcest resource. The Jeep carriers, Escort carriers, CVEs, 1,942 to 1,945. If the Independence-class represented clever improvisation, the escort carriers were the product of pure industrial brute force. Designated CVE and nicknamed by their crews combustible, vulnerable, expendable, these small carriers were built on merchant ship and tanker hulls using mass production techniques. They were slow, unarmored, carried small air groups, and were never intended for fleet engagements. Yet, the United States built 122 of them during the war, more than any other type of carrier, and their contribution to Allied victory was immense. The concept originated with the British, who desperately needed air cover for Atlantic convoys being devastated by German U-boats. The first American escort carrier, USS Long Island, CVE-1, was converted from a C-3 class cargo ship in 1941 as a proof of concept. This led to 3 main production classes: the Bogue-class, based on standard C-3 cargo hulls. 45 were built, with many transferred to the Royal Navy under Lend-Lease. These were the workhorses of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Sangamon-class, a group of 4 larger and more capable CVEs converted from fleet oiler hulls. Their original tanker capacity gave them exceptional operational range, and they saw significant action in both the Atlantic and Pacific. The Casablanca-class, the most numerous class of aircraft carrier ever built. 50 ships were constructed by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards in just over a year using assembly line techniques adapted from Liberty ship production. Unlike the others, they were built on purpose-designed but still simple hulls. The CVEs shared common characteristics that defined their limitations. Speed was their greatest weakness, typically 16 to 19 knots maximum. This was too slow to generate sufficient wind over deck for launching heavily laden aircraft in calm conditions, and it prevented them from operating with the 30-knot fast carrier task forces. They carried only 20 to 28 aircraft, usually a mix of Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. They were almost completely unarmored, essentially merchant hulls with a flight deck bolted on top. But numbers compensated for individual weakness, and specialized roles negated many of their limitations. The CVEs fought two distinct wars. In the Atlantic, CVEs were the solution to the U-boat crisis. German submarines had been sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening Britain's ability to continue fighting. Land-based patrol aircraft could cover convoys near the coasts of North America and Britain, but a vast section of the mid-Atlantic, the Black Pit, was beyond their range. U-boats operated freely in this gap. The CVE solved this problem. Organized into hunter-killer groups, one CVE escorted by several destroyers, they either accompanied convoys or roamed independently hunting submarines. The CVE's aircraft could spot surfaced U-boats from dozens of miles away and attack with depth charges, rockets, and machine guns. Even if the aircraft didn't sink the submarine, forcing it to dive allowed the destroyers to close in and attack with sonar and depth charges. This tactic was devastatingly effective. By mid-1943, the combination of improved convoy tactics, enhanced radar, code breaking, and CVE-based air cover had broken the back of the U-boat fleet. German submarines went from sinking 600,000 tons of Allied shipping per month in late 1942 to being hunted to near extinction by late 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic, arguably the most strategically critical campaign of the entire war, was won in large part by these unglamorous merchant hull carriers. In the Pacific, the CVEs performed a different but equally vital mission. Their slow speed kept them away from the main fleet battles. Instead, they provided close air support for amphibious invasions. While the fast carriers of Task Force 58 hunted the Japanese fleet, CVEs remained with the vulnerable troop transports and landing craft at the invasion beachhead. Their aircraft flew combat air patrol over the invasion fleet, spotted for naval gunfire, and attacked enemy positions just ahead of advancing troops. They served as an on-call air force for the Marines and soldiers on the ground, providing immediate support that land-based aircraft couldn't deliver until airfields were captured and made operational. This role was unglamorous but absolutely critical. Every major amphibious operation from the Gilbert Islands through Okinawa relied on CVE support. They took losses, several were sunk by submarines, kamikazes, and at Samar, as we'll examine next, but the mission succeeded. Without CVE air cover, the island-hopping campaign would have been far bloodier and slower. The CVEs demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, adequate platforms produced in overwhelming numbers could be more strategically valuable than small numbers of superior platforms. Their crews knew they sailed on vulnerable ships, hence the dark humor nicknames, but they also knew their mission was essential, and one group of CVEs would face a test no one anticipated. Taffy 3's impossible stand. Battle off Samar, the 25th of October 1944. The finest hour for any escort carrier, and one of the most remarkable engagements in naval history, occurred on the 25th of October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. A small task unit designated Taffy 3 was providing air support for the Leyte invasion when lookouts spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Within minutes, the impossible became reality. The Japanese sent to force 4 battleships, including the 72,000-ton super battleship Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers was closing at high speed. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The disparity was absurd. Yamato alone displaced more than the entire American force combined. Her 18-inch guns could reach out 25 miles. The CVE's single 5-inch stern gun had a range under 10 miles. By every rational calculation, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated in under an hour. But warfare is not purely rational. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, ordered his carriers to turn into the wind and launch every available aircraft armed with whatever ordnance happened to be loaded. Many planes launched with depth charges intended for anti-submarine patrol or with no ordnance at all, making repeated dry strafing runs simply to harass the Japanese ships. The CVEs generated smoke and began a fighting retreat, dodging salvos of 14-inch and 18-inch shells that sent up geysers taller than the carrier's masts. Meanwhile, the destroyers and destroyer escorts did something that should have been suicidal, but was executed with such precision and aggression that it became tactically brilliant. They charged the Japanese fleet head-on, laying smoke to screen the carriers, closing to torpedo range, and launching attacks that forced the Japanese battleships to maneuver defensively. USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, attacked Yamato alone, forcing the super battleship to turn away. USS Hoel charged a column of Japanese cruisers. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort with guns designed for anti-submarine work, engaged Japanese heavy cruisers at point-blank range. The constant air attacks and the ferocity of the destroyer screen created confusion in the Japanese command. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, believed he was facing the main American fast carrier fleet, not a collection of escort carriers and destroyers. Japanese ships broke formation to pursue individual targets. Communications degraded. After more than 2 hours of chaotic combat, Kurita lost his nerve and ordered a withdrawal, convinced he was walking into a trap. Taffy 3 paid a heavy price. Destroyers Johnston and Hoel and destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts were sunk fighting to the last. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, CVE 73, was hit repeatedly by Japanese cruisers and sank, the only U.S. carrier in history sunk by naval gunfire. Shortly after the surface action ended, kamikaze aircraft struck the force. USS Street, Low CVE 63, was hit and exploded, becoming the first major warship sunk by a kamikaze attack. But the Japanese center force retreated. MacArthur's invasion fleet was saved. Taffy 3's desperate stand had accomplished what no rational analysis would have predicted possible. The battle demonstrated that ship quality matters less than crew quality, and that courage, when combined with tactical aggression, can overcome overwhelming material disadvantage. For the escort carriers, Samar was both vindication and tragedy. These expendable ships, crewed by men who knew they sailed on vulnerable platforms, had stood their ground against the most powerful surface force Japan could assemble, and they had won. The war winners arrive. Essex-class design philosophy. 1943. While the stopgap carriers plugged the holes and held the line, the ultimate answer to American carrier needs was already taking shape in shipyards across the United States. The Essex-class fleet carrier was the culmination of 2 decades of carrier development, incorporating every lesson learned from Langley through the desperate battles of 1942. These were the ships that would win the Pacific War. The design was finalized in 1940, before Pearl Harbor, but reflected all the pre-war doctrinal development and operational experience the Navy had accumulated. With the Washington and London naval treaties now defunct, designers were unconstrained by tonnage limits. The result was a ship optimized for a single purpose, putting the maximum number of aircraft into combat as quickly and efficiently as possible, while surviving long enough to repeat the process. The hull was enlarged to 27,100 tons standard displacement, 35% larger than the Yorktown-Class. Length increased to 872 feet, providing more deck space for flight operations. The hull was widened, which improved stability and allowed for a broader flight deck with more room for aircraft handling. But size alone wasn't the goal. Every increase in dimensions served a specific operational requirement. Aircraft capacity was the central focus. The Essex-class was designed to carry 90 to 100 aircraft, but more importantly, to operate them at a high tempo. The hangar deck was larger and had higher overhead clearance than previous carriers, accommodating the heavier, more powerful aircraft entering service. The F-6F Hellcat fighter, the SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber, and the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. These aircraft were superior to their predecessors in every measurable way: faster, longer-ranged, better armed, more survivable. The deck-edge elevator pioneered on the Yorktown-Class was retained and improved. The Essex-class had 3 elevators, 2 centerline and 1 on the port deck edge. The deck-edge elevator was critical. It could be operated continuously without creating a massive hole in the flight deck. This meant aircraft could be brought up from the hangar while landing and launching operations continued on the main deck. In practice, this feature allowed the Essex-class to sustain a much higher sortie rate than earlier carriers. More planes in the air, more often, meant more striking power. Protection was dramatically improved. The Essex-class featured a comprehensive underwater protection system designed to absorb torpedo hits, multiple layers of void spaces, fuel tanks, and compartments intended to contain flooding. The armored belt at the waterline was 2.5 to 4 inches thick. Critically, the hangar deck was armored a 1.5-inch steel deck designed to protect the ship's machinery, magazines, and fuel tanks from bombs that penetrated the flight deck. This was a departure from the British practice of armoring the flight deck itself, which reduced aircraft capacity. The American philosophy was that losing aircraft was acceptable, losing the ship was not. Anti-aircraft armament was revolutionary. Early in the war, carrier AA defense was inadequate. The Essex-class mounted 12 5-inch divided by 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in twin mounts, directed by advanced radar fire control systems. These guns could engage aircraft at long range with proximity-fused shells. For close-in defense, the ships carried 68 Bofors 40mm autocannons in quad mounts and dozens of Oerlikon 20mm cannons. This created overlapping fields of fire that made attacking the ship suicidal for enemy aircraft. By 1944, an Essex-class carrier was one of the most heavily defended platforms in existence. Propulsion was uprated to 150,000 shaft horsepower, giving a top speed of 33 knots. This allowed the ships to outrun submarines, keep pace with the fastest surface combatants, and generate sufficient wind over deck for flight operations, even in calm conditions. Fuel capacity was greatly increased, extending operational range to over 20,000 nautical miles at cruising speed, critical for sustained operations across the vast Pacific. The Essex-class was not an experimental design. It was a mature, optimized platform that incorporated 20 years of institutional learning. When the first ship, USS Essex, CV-9, was commissioned on the 31st of December 1942, the U.S. Navy finally had the carrier it needed. The problem was that it had only one. The question was whether American industry could deliver them fast enough to matter. The answer was overwhelming. The Avalanche, Essex-class production and deployment. 24 Essex-class carriers were ordered. 17 were commissioned and saw service during World War II. 7 more were completed shortly after the war ended. This was an unprecedented feat of industrial production. For comparison, Japan commissioned 9 fleet carriers during the entire war. Britain built 6 fleet carriers. The United States built nearly 3 times that number of single-class ships, larger, more capable, and more complex than anything either ally or enemy fielded. The first wave began reaching the fleet in mid-1943. USS Essex CV-9 in December 1942, USS Yorktown CV-10 in April 1943, USS Lexington CV-16 in February 1943, both named for carriers lost in 1942, carrying forward their legacy. USS Bunker Hill CV-17 in May 1943. The ships kept coming. By late 1943, the Navy had 5 Essex-class carriers operational. By mid-1944, a dozen. By the end of the war, 17. The arrival of the Essex-class transformed the naval balance in the Pacific. These ships didn't trickle into service, they arrived as a wave. And they didn't operate independently. They formed the core of the Fast Carrier Task Force, designated Task Force 58 when operating under Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet, and Task Force 38 under Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet. The organizational structure was unprecedented. The task force was divided into 4 task groups, each built around 3 to 4 carriers, usually a mix of Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers. Each task group included battleships, cruisers, and destroyers for escort and anti-aircraft defense. The entire force operated under unified command with centralized fighter direction using radar. At its peak strength in 1945, Task Force 58/38 fielded 16 carriers, 8 battleships, and over 1,000 aircraft. This wasn't a fleet. It was a mobile air force that could project power anywhere in the Pacific. The Japanese had no counter. Their carrier force had been shattered at Midway and bled white in the Solomon Islands campaign. By 1944, Japan could still build carriers. They commissioned several during the war, but they couldn't train replacement pilots fast enough to crew them effectively. The veteran aviators who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941-42 were dead. Their replacements had a fraction of the training time and flew inferior aircraft. The Essex-class gave the U.S. Navy not just numerical superiority but qualitative dominance. The ships themselves were superior platforms, better protected, better armed, capable of higher sortie rates. The aircraft they carried, Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers, outperformed their Japanese counterparts in speed, range, firepower, and survivability. The pilots flying them had far more training time and benefited from superior radar-directed fighter control, and there were simply more of everything. More carriers, more aircraft, more fuel, more ordnance. The result was systematic destruction. Beginning with the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943, Task Force 58/38 methodically dismantled Japanese positions across the Central Pacific: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Truk Lagoon. The Gibraltar of the Pacific was neutralized by airstrikes that destroyed over 250 Japanese aircraft and sank dozens of ships. The Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At each operation, the carrier force provided air superiority, struck Japanese airfields and shipping, and supported amphibious landings. The Japanese could not contest American control of the sea or air. No Essex-class carrier was lost to enemy action during the war. This wasn't luck. It was the result of superior design, crew training, and damage control capability. Several ships took catastrophic damage, and survived events we'll examine shortly. But the fundamental point stands. The U.S. Navy built a class of carriers that could absorb punishment that would have sunk earlier designs, and could deliver it in overwhelming measure. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was the decisive carrier engagement of the Pacific War. It demonstrated the full extent of American superiority not through individual heroics or tactical brilliance, but through systemic, overwhelming dominance across every dimension of carrier operations. The strategic context was the invasion of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Saipan was critical for Japan, close enough to the home islands for B-29 bombers to reach Tokyo. The Japanese committed their remaining carrier strength to defend it. 9 carriers, including the new fleet carriers Taiho and Shokaku, with around 430 aircraft embarked. Facing them was Task Force 58, 15 carriers, including 7 Essex-class and 8 light carriers, with over 900 aircraft. On the morning of the 19th of June 1944, Japanese scout planes located the American fleet. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched 4 massive airstrikes, 373 aircraft total. This should have been sufficient to overwhelm any fleet's defenses. It was the largest carrier-based airstrike the Japanese Navy had launched since Pearl Harbor. The Americans detected the incoming raids on radar at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats to intercept. What followed was not a battle, it was slaughter. American pilots, flying superior aircraft and directed by radar, intercepted the Japanese formations far from the fleet. The Japanese attack waves were torn apart. Formations that reached the task force encountered the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of dozens of ships. Of the 373 aircraft launched, approximately 330 were shot down. American losses: 29 aircraft. Pilots returning to their carriers described the engagement as a turkey shoot. The name stuck. One pilot reported shooting down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single sortie. Another reported that Japanese formations were so poorly coordinated that they flew in straight lines, making gunnery trivially easy. The slaughter continued into the afternoon. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 600 aircraft, 3/4 of their embarked air strength, and suffered the loss of 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, to American submarines. The Japanese naval air arm never recovered. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American sailors, broke Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The pilots lost that day were irreplaceable. Japan had carriers remaining, but they had almost no trained aviators to fly from them. The victory was not the result of superior courage or better tactics. It was the result of superior systems. American radar detected threats at ranges Japanese eyes couldn't match. American fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and more rugged. American pilots had hundreds of hours more training. American damage control saved carriers that took hits. American industrial capacity replaced losses in weeks. The battle demonstrated that by mid-1944, the Pacific War was effectively decided. Japan could not contest American naval and air superiority. The Kamikaze Test. Surviving the Unsurvivable. 1945. The final test of the Essex-class design came from a threat no one had anticipated: the kamikaze. Beginning in October 1944 and intensifying through the Okinawa campaign in 1945, Japanese pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. This was not desperation, it was doctrine, a calculated response to overwhelming American material superiority. If a conventional attack had a 5% hit probability, a suicide attack had a much higher probability, and a hit by a kamikaze loaded with bombs and fuel was often catastrophic. The kamikaze campaign inflicted severe damage on the U.S. fleet. At Okinawa alone, kamikazes sank 36 ships and damaged hundreds more. Destroyers on radar picket duty, isolated and exposed, suffered horrific losses. But the Essex-class carriers, despite being high-priority targets, proved remarkably survivable. USS Franklin, CV-13, represents the extreme test case. On the 19th of March 1945, operating off the coast of Japan, Franklin was hit by 2 bombs dropped from a single Japanese dive bomber that penetrated her combat air patrol. The bombs struck the flight deck, which was packed with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for a strike. One bomb penetrated to the hangar deck, the other detonated among the aircraft on the flight deck. The result was apocalyptic. Fueled aircraft exploded, ordnance cooked off, fires spread through the hangar deck and up to the flight deck. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as bomb and torpedo magazines detonated. The flight deck buckled. Entire sections of the ship were consumed by flames reaching temperatures that melted steel. Over 800 men died in the initial explosions and fires the highest single-ship casualty count of the war for the U.S. Navy. By any rational assessment, Franklin should have sunk. The fires were out of control. Power was lost. Steering was lost. The ship listed heavily. The order was given to abandon ship, and most of the crew went over the side. But the core structure held. The armored hangar deck contained the worst of the explosions. The watertight compartmentalization limited flooding, and a skeleton crew volunteers who remained aboard fought the fires for hours. The cruiser USS Pittsburgh took Franklin under tow. Over the next 24 hours, the remaining crew gradually brought the fires under control, restored partial power, and stabilized the list. Franklin made it back to Pearl Harbor, then transited to New York for repairs under her own power for most of the journey. She survived the war. Her survival remains the most extreme example of damage a carrier absorbed and lived through. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, suffered a similar ordeal at Okinawa in May 1945. 2 kamikazes struck within 30 seconds. One hit the flight deck. The second crashed into the base of the island superstructure. Fueled aircraft ignited. Fires swept the deck. Over 390 men died. But the ship survived. Her armored hangar deck and damage control systems contained the damage long enough for the crew to extinguish the fires. USS Intrepid, CV-11, was hit by kamikazes 4 times during the war, more than any other Essex-class carrier. She survived all 4 attacks. USS Enterprise CV-6, the lone pre-war survivor still in service, took a kamikaze off Okinawa in May 1945 that finally put her out of the war. But she survived and made it home. The kamikaze campaign demonstrated that the Essex-class design philosophy was fundamentally sound. The armored hangar deck protected the ship's vital machinery and magazines from catastrophic secondary explosions. The extensive compartmentalization limited flooding. The damage control systems, trained crews, redundant fire suppression, portable pumps gave the ships a fighting chance even after horrific damage. And the robust construction meant that the core structure remained intact even when everything above it was burning. The British had chosen a different design path, armored flight decks, which reduced aircraft capacity but made their carriers nearly immune to kamikaze damage. American carriers took more damage from kamikazes than British carriers did. But American carriers also carried larger air groups and sustained higher sortie rates. The choice was a calculated trade-off. Accept higher vulnerability in exchange for greater offensive power. And when American carriers were hit, their protection systems proved sufficient to save the ship in all but the most extreme cases. 0 Essex-class carriers were lost to enemy action. This statistic, more than any other, validates the design. Epilogue, the Midway-Class, and the Supercarrier age. Even as Essex-class carriers were winning the Pacific War, the U.S. Navy was planning the next generation. The result was the Midway-Class, a design so large and heavily protected that it represented a new category, the Supercarrier. These ships were designed based on the harshest lessons of the war, specifically the need for armored flight decks to withstand kamikaze attacks and heavy bombs. Though commissioned too late to see combat in World War II, they embodied the culmination of wartime carrier evolution. The design process began in 1942, before the kamikaze threat emerged. The driving requirement was increased protection. British carriers had demonstrated that armored flight decks made ships far more resilient to bomb hits. A Japanese bomb that would cripple an American carrier might merely dent a British flight deck. But British carriers paid for this protection with reduced aircraft capacity. The Midway-Class was an attempt to have both, a large American-style air group and a heavily armored flight deck. The result was massive. USS Midway, CV-41, displaced 45,000 tons, 50% larger than the Essex-class. The flight deck was armored with 3.5 inches of steel, sufficient to withstand heavy bombs and kamikazes. The hangar deck was also armored. The underwater protection system was the most sophisticated ever fitted to a carrier, designed to absorb multiple torpedo hits. Anti-aircraft armament was increased to 18 5-inch divided by 54 caliber guns, a newer, longer-range variant than the 5-inch divided by 38 seconds on the Essex-class. The planned air group was enormous, over 130 aircraft, significantly more than the Essex-class carried. This was necessary because the aircraft entering service in 1945 were larger and heavier than their predecessors. Jets were on the horizon. The Midway-Class was designed with future growth in mind, a platform that could adapt to larger, heavier, faster aircraft. 3 ships were completed. USS Midway, CV-41, was commissioned on the 10th of September 1945, 8 days after Japan signed the surrender documents ending World War II. USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, CV-42, followed in October 1945. USS Coral Sea, CV-43, was commissioned in October 1947. They missed the war they were designed for entirely, but their design proved sound. All 3 ships underwent extensive modifications over the decades. Angled flight decks were added in the 1,950 seconds. Steam catapults replaced hydraulic catapults. Electronics and radar were continuously upgraded. They transitioned to jet operations seamlessly. USS Midway served through the Vietnam War, where she launched thousands of combat sorties, and participated in Operation Desert Storm in 1991, 46 years after her commissioning. She was finally decommissioned in 1992, the longest-serving aircraft carrier in U.S. Navy history. She now serves as a museum ship in San Diego. The Midway-Class validated the evolutionary path the U.S. Navy had followed from Langley through Essex. Each generation of carrier had been larger, better protected, and more capable than the last. The Midway-Class represented the endpoint of World War II carrier design, a ship tough enough to survive anything the enemy could throw at it, large enough to carry a massive air group, and adaptable enough to remain relevant for half a century. More importantly, the Midway-Class established the template for the modern supercarrier. The next generation, the Forrestal class of the 1,950 seconds, would be even larger, purpose-built for jets. They would lead to the Kitty Hawk class, then the nuclear-powered Enterprise, CVN-65, followed by the Nimitz class, and finally the Gerald R. Ford class, which entered service today. But all of them trace their lineage to the wartime evolution from Langley to Midway. The doctrine, operational concepts, and design principles all were established during World War II.